Daniel Tkie is an economist and also associate fellow at the Chatham House Russia and Eurasia program. Welcome to our program, Mr. Tkie.
My pleasure.
Ukrainian army has captured 2 Chinese citizens who were fighting as a part of the Russian army. China denies this information, and also US State Department says that it was disturbing to see such reports. What kind of game China is playing right now? What is your take on that?
Well, it's certainly embarrassing for China. I mean, China has suggested that it's kind of neutral in the war. We don't know, on what basis these Chinese citizens have been fighting. Are they private citizens who are just mercenaries for Russia, or is there some state-level involvement? But, I guess Ukraine has tried to have reasonable relations with China. Obviously, it's tried to lobby China to reduce its support for Russia. The Chinese have also been quite careful, not to go out of their way, I guess, to support Russia because of concerns about its relationship with the US and of making the whole tariff situation much more difficult. So, it's embarrassing for the Chinese, definitely.
And also President Zelensky says that many more Chinese citizens are fighting on the Russian side in Ukraine alongside with the Russian troops. So what could this indicate from your perspective?
Well, I think President Zelensky's mentioned the number of, 150 was mentioned. Again, that's a significant number. Again, we've seen, soldiers or mercenaries from many different nationalities really fight on both sides, right? I mean, that's the kind of reality. I would think the Chinese government would now try and crack down on Chinese citizens heading to Ukraine, specifically to support the Russians, because again they're in a very difficult, delicate negotiation at the moment with the Trump administration about tariffs. I don't think they'll particularly want to complicate that with what's going on in Ukraine. They're in a very vulnerable position, obviously, on tariffs. I noted that while the US government's messaging around Russia has been quite modest and relatively pro-Russian, you could argue, whereas in China, actually, the messaging is very aggressive, very hawkish. And I noticed yesterday, I think the statement from the State Department, or in the State Department press conference, the US officials were, again, quite aggressive against China in terms of this specific activity in Ukraine. So, again, the Chinese are in a very difficult position.
Let's cover also Donald Trump's efforts to end the war in Ukraine. President Trump said that he was not happy about Russia bombing Ukraine like crazy, as he said. What is your assessment of these efforts to reach a quick full ceasefire deal, as Vladimir Putin rejects full ceasefire?
Well, it's a bit embarrassing for President Trump, right? I mean, he started off saying that he could end the war in 24 hours and then a month and then 100 days. And it's, his peace efforts are not really going very far. And his difficulty here is that I and many other people have argued he had a very strong negotiating hand, but unfortunately gave a lot away to the Russians straight away. We saw Steve Witkoff's comments with Tucker Carlson. The problem is that, I don't see the deal that Trump and Putin are trying to impose is a particularly good deal for Ukraine. Any deal without any security assurance, I just cannot see Ukraine accepting that. Obviously there's been focus in the Trump administration around the minerals deal again. That deal looks to be devastatingly bad for Ukraine. Again, I can't imagine the Ukrainians would ever sign that deal. What is Trump going to do, to offer to Ukrainians to make a deal interesting? And I guess the other difficulty for Trump has been he's been so soft with Putin. I think Putin himself shows no willingness particularly to do a deal. He thinks he can get everything he wants the longer he waits out. I think he sees Trump as soft. He can roll Trump over quite easily. So I think from both the Ukrainian and the Russian perspective, there's, a lack of really willingness to sit down and talk a peace, because both sides think, Ukraine thinks he's not getting very much from the deal. Russia thinks it can get a lot more from any deal.
And also, is there any chances Trump going after Putin? He's threatening secondary tariff sanctions on Russian economy, but would this work with Vladimir Putin and his war machine?
Well, it would work, and especially now that oil prices are going lower because of the tariffs war. I mean, we saw Brent fall below $60. It's recovered a bit, but Urals also around 50. I mean, that's devastating for the Russian economy. And I think Trump has lots of leverage, but unfortunately, we've seen Trump seems to be afraid of strongman characters, or he likes strongman characters. He seems very reluctant to take Putin on, to annoy Putin. He's been very friendly to Putin, and what we've seen is bullying of what Trump perceives as being the weaker players. He thinks he can push Ukraine around. He doesn't feel able to push Russia around, even though I think Putin's in a relatively weak position himself. So, I mean, I think Ukrainians probably don't trust Trump very much at this point in time.
And also, you just mentioned about the Russian oil, and it's also true that Russian crude oil, for example, Urals, fell to approximately $52 per barrel last week. Do you feel that this trade war between US and China could even more reduce prices on Russian oil?
Look, I think, we've obviously seen lots of volatility in markets. We saw Trump concede lifting a lot of the tariffs on his allies, or US allies, apart from China. Obviously, China's not an ally, but maintaining those very aggressive sanctions. I mean, I think a big conclusion from all this is global growth will be weaker. The global economy probably will go into recession because of all this. The trade wars are going to be very disruptive for global economic activity. And I think it means probably oil and commodity prices will stay lower for longer. That's good news for Ukraine, bad news for Russia. It will make it more difficult for Putin to sustain the war. It increases his vulnerabilities. As I said, if Trump wanted to exploit Russian weakness around oil prices, he could certainly push Putin to the negotiating table, I think, at this point in time. But again, it's up to Trump, how Trump plays it. I don't think Ukraine is a huge priority for him, unfortunately. And he doesn't want to annoy Putin from what I can make out. So again, it seems unlikely that he's going to put maximum pressure on Russia like he seems to be doing on Iran, right? I mean, there's a lot of focus on that. Max pressure on Iran, negotiations ongoing, or perhaps going to happen quite soon in Oman.
And also, if he decides to put pressure on Russia, can he reduce oil prices even more, from your perspective?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, if we see a big Iran-US-Israel deal, that would presumably reduce the geopolitical premium on oil prices around the Middle East. Again, that would be bad news for Putin, I would imagine.
Also, US President Trump says that he is applying a 90-day pause on his tariffs against all countries except China, and also he announced rising tariffs on China to 125%. What was the reason why he backed down, why he reversed his decision on tariffs against almost all countries around the world? Pressure from his billionaires, from the Wall Street, or maybe from the main CEOs of main companies, as the head of the JP Morgan also said, criticized this decision. What is your take on that?
Well, look, I don't think Besant, the Treasury Secretary, suggested this was part of a big plan by Trump. I don't believe that. I mean, these tariffs were rolled out in a chaotic way. The formula that was used to determine the tariffs was a joke, right? Not based on any economic theory, particularly. And, I think in the end, the markets were falling because there was a lack of credibility and confidence in US policy in the White House, right? And, yesterday, I mean, we saw the US bond market start to crack. I mean, if that would have happened, that was quite extraordinary. So I think markets, in the end, forced Trump to concede on the tariff story. And I think, they argued that China has not played a very clever hand. Actually, I'd say the opposite. I mean, the Chinese administration looking at this saw weakness in the Trump White House. It saw, again, as I said, a disastrous rollout of tariff policy, right? I mean, the US has isolated itself from its allies because of this and because of its security policy. And China will think that it has the advantage. All it has to do is play tough, don't concede anything, and Trump will basically roll over because Trump, through the market process, is very, very vulnerable.
And do you believe that China has more chances to win a trade war rather than the United States?
I do now, yes, because I think we've seen Trump's vulnerability, which is the markets. His vulnerability is the markets and his billionaire friends around him who don't like, suffering big mark-to-market losses on their various portfolios and their investments, right? So, and also the Republican Party as well. I mean, we saw some divisions appearing there. And China seems to have rallied the country behind the leadership. There is a message from China that, they survived COVID, they've built up defenses, they've built up buffers, they can ride out a trade war with the Americans, and that actually it's existential for them. I mean, look, I think what we've learned from Trump in the 100 days or so he's been in office is, again, he's a bit of a bully, he looks for weakness, and if you end up being the weaker partner, you are going to get exploited, right? Unfortunately, like the Ukraine energy deal, or minerals deal, I should say. So if I were the Chinese, I would make sure that I stayed tough, I bluffed Trump out, and I make sure that I don't end up looking weak, because if the Chinese lose this trade war, they're in a very difficult position, because I think Trump will continue to exploit them, or exploit that weakness.
What are the chances for a recession even after a reversal of many tariffs against countries?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's a high probability now, because for a number of reasons. Firstly, I mean, the whole textbook theory of trade is that, trade liberalization, globalization lead to higher global growth, cheaper products, lower inflation. So you reverse that, means lower growth, higher inflation, it means stagflation. Aside from that, I think the uncertainty around tariffs, both on China and more broadly, will disrupt global supply chains. We'll see companies delaying decisions about exporting, waiting until there's more clarity. And I think we're already seeing that. There was a piece in the FT today that said a lot of Chinese companies are stalling deliveries to the US because they simply don't know what to charge, right? And so I think that disruption to supply chains that we saw that in COVID, I think it does disrupt economic activity, right? It creates uncertainty, leads to less consumption, less investment. It's a nightmare for the global economy.
Let's cover also the recent public debate between Elon Musk, Trump's favorite billionaire, and also Mr. Navarro, Trump's main envoy, and also his main part of the team on working on these tariffs. How can you assess this big rift between billionaires and Trump's officials?
Look, I think it goes to the heart of the issue in the White House about tariffs in China. I think the billionaires, the Musks, they've made a lot of money in China, right? I don't think theirs is an ideological, national security, particularly related issue around China. They do, I guess, want to rebalance trade in the US's favor, boost the US economy, bring some jobs home, all those kind of things. I think the Navarro-style characters, they hate China with a vengeance, and they see this as this hegemonic battle for global supremacy between China and the US. And they think ultimately there's a war going to happen between China and the US, and tariffs are a massive tool to weaken and undermine China, right? So I think perhaps for think for the Navarro-style characters, it's a zero-sum game, right? It's about ensuring the US wins that game. I think maybe for the Musk guys and some of the billionaires, I mean, perhaps they can see a win-win scenario where ultimately global tariffs reduce, you have a freer global trade environment, and ultimately perhaps global growth is better. But I don't want to put words in their mouths. But so there's this battle within the administration, and we're not sure who's going to win out. But the problem is, all this uncertainty about where tariffs are is terrible for global confidence. And again, that's going to be the factor ultimately that drives global growth weaker.
And also, how do you rebalance global trade in an appropriate way without using such high tariffs from your perspective? How should these things be done in an appropriate way?
Well, look, I mean, I guess there is some sense in having a fairer global trading regime. You could argue China has taken advantage of globalization, particularly by keeping its currency cheap over many years, accumulating a huge buffer of foreign exchange reserves. I mean, in effect, what the Chinese have done is kept an undervalued exchange rate, exploited Chinese consumers and the population by keeping their labor cheap through the exchange rate, and then making windfall profits from that through trade and current account surpluses and buying FX reserves to keep their currency weak and accumulating this huge foreign exchange buffer that they then use to buy influence globally. So I guess, allowing currency appreciation, less intervention by the Chinese in their exchange rate, allowing the currency to reflect its trade surpluses, I guess, is probably the best way. And then less non-tariff barriers, all those kind of things in the end are probably ultimately the best way to rebalance everything. But you're never going to rebalance perfectly, right? Because, it's not just about the merchandise trade position. It's about the services account. It's about the capital account. Some countries, it depends on their level of development. I mean, they may need to run, because they're importing capital, they need to, and they have a low savings rate, they may need to run large deficits on the trade and current accounts for a period of time. Comparative advantage. The global rules of comparative advantage. Some countries probably it's logical for to run merchandise trade surpluses. Perhaps again counterbalanced by perhaps current less positive services and capital account positions. It's complicated, and I can tell you what is clear is the Trump administration is not going to rebalance merchandise trade positions by using crazy formulas that have no bearing on economics.
And also, let's cover Trump's most interesting statements throughout this day. He said that countries hit by his tariffs are calling up and kissing his ass. Don't you think that Donald Trump hates his allies? Does he hate European
Yes.
allies?
Well, he seems to do. I mean, he seems to hate Europeans, maybe not the British. He seems to have a fondness for the UK because of his family background, perhaps. I mean, I think the difficulty in this is, look, the way the Trump administration have framed the trade wars now is this is a fight with China, and allies can get preferential tariffs if they ally with the Americans against China. That's fine, but I think many of the US's traditional allies are, concerned about the direction of travel in the US now. They're not quite sure, given the Trump presidency, J.D. Vance's comments in Europe. They're not quite sure if they share the same values and interests. And I think they'd be quite reluctant now to put all their eggs in the American basket. I think from a trade, financing, and national security perspective, I think they'll probably be looking to diversify their relationships away from the Americans. So maybe, it's not been such a clever approach from the Trump administration, isolating all these traditional allies. And maybe some of those traditional allies actually secretly will quite like it if the Chinese play hardball and actually cut the Americans down to size a bit around this issue.
Let's also cover our final topic, this big rare earths deal between minerals deal between Ukraine and the United States. Is there a chance for Ukraine to reach a normal deal with the United States on its minerals?
Look, I mean, what is in it for Ukraine? That's the question, right? I mean, this deal seems to give everything to the Americans. What are they getting, right? I mean, Ukraine, that is. And I think really the idea from the Americans is, this deal will see American companies invest in Ukraine. That's a win-win for everyone. And the mere fact that American companies are operating in Ukraine ensures Russia won't attack Ukraine. Firstly, international business will not invest in Ukraine unless there's security. It will not accept vague promises from the Trump administration, or really no promises, actually. But this general kind of assumption that merely having American companies on the ground will mean that Russia won't attack. Russia has attacked before Ukraine invaded, when there were plenty of American companies on the ground. So it didn't seem to make a difference in the past. So I think this minerals deal is not worth the paper it's written on, unless there are specific security guarantees from the Americans. So I would advise Ukraine not to sign it. I can understand why they continue to negotiate. Maybe they want a better deal. Maybe they think they can get security guarantees included. Maybe they just don't feel able at this point in time to say no to the US, the Trump administration. There's still quite a big package of financial or military support in warehouses that the Ukrainians probably want to get access to from the Americans before there's a break in the US-Ukraine relationship, which there may be if Ukraine ultimately decides to walk away from peace talks. So I think the Ukrainians are kind of stringing the Americans on a little bit, as long as they can, because ultimately they know this deal doesn't do anything for Ukraine.
And is this break between US and Ukraine, in US-Ukraine relations, is this break inevitable from your perspective?
Well, it depends on the course of Russia-US relations. There are, obviously in the US, there's plenty of supporters of Ukraine, particularly in the Republican Party. So it depends how Putin plays things also. I mean, if Putin just continues to stall on peace talks, it could well be quite difficult for Trump to continue with that trend in terms of the relationship with Russia. So I think actually both sides, both Ukraine and Russia, are playing Trump, pretending to go along with negotiations when both of them really are not comfortable with where negotiations are going. So yes, it's possible that Ukraine could win this kind of this battle over negotiations or battle for the heart and mind of the Trump administration. It's quite possible because of an error by the Putin administration, I guess.
Thank you, Mr. Ash, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.